Hello, welcome to Zoonosis with Joy. I'm Joy, and today we're going to be talking about another cheery subject on this channel, nuclear war, and specifically what the role of the veterinarian is during a nuclear conflict. We'll be going over food animals and companion animals specifically, and if you have any questions or comments about this video, leave them in the comment section below. When I was growing up, the big thing was zombies. There was all sorts of media about the zombie apocalypse and about what one would do to survive the zombie apocalypse and what one's role would be. People were obsessed with making teams and thinking of people in their lives or different kinds of archetypes that they could have on their team in order to survive this hypothetical and non-existent sort of threat. This sort of activity usually involved picking 4 or 5 people that you could depend on to be helpful in this kind of survivor situation. One of the common people or archetypes mentioned was a veterinarian. Veterinarians have a lot of different skills that are often valuable in these kind of situations, and for the most part what people were thinking of is basically a rugged cowboy doctor with a gun who could euthanize animals at the drop of a hat and do dirty surgeries in a field and knows this kind of country medicine stuff. I don't know. It's a little bit patronizing because of course veterinarians are not just discount bulk barn doctors, but they have their own roles and activities. Now, nevertheless, of course, in a disaster situation, a veterinarian can act as a paramedic. Ideally under the guidance of a human physician. They're specialists in a very specific kind of primate, and we don't really learn about that at all, for good reason. So I want to kind of investigate what it would look like in a real life situation. What sort of things would a veterinarian be doing in a nuclear war? Now, there's never been a nuclear war. There's been nuclear strikes on cities, famously during World War II on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but this has never happened in real life yet, although it is something that I think is likely inevitable in the future. So kind of in this scenario, what I'm imagining is an international nuclear conflict where multiple cities and countries are attacked with nuclear weapons. This would likely result in the deaths of tens, if not hundreds of millions of people. It would be one of the biggest disasters in human history, and it would be by far the largest man-made disaster in history. In the immediate aftermath after a strike, of course, veterinarians are going to be playing crucial roles on the ground just like everyone else. The basic things of survival, such as finding shelter, putting out fires, finding survivors, finding the dead, treating wounds, that kind of thing. Under the guidance of a physician, a veterinarian can be a paramedic. We know basic, first aid, how to bandage a wound, and how to do CPR. Beyond that, of course, you would want a doctor to actually examine the patient and make a treatment plan. A veterinarian can't do that with a human. That said, there will be animals in this immediate post-strike phase. There will be animals that people bring into fallout shelters, and there will be animals who need attending to by veterinarians, either due to radiation burns, radiation sickness, or due to debris and fires, that kind of thing. So there will be a role there for veterinarians as well. So, of course, in that immediate impact in the first days and weeks, that would be something that is going to be highly individual dependent, depending on where the veterinarian is and the circumstances that are involved. But what about in the weeks to months afterwards? What sort of things would be a veterinarian doing? Is their role superfluous in this kind of nuclear hellscape, or is it something that they can be very valuable? I'll start with food animals because this is the most obvious case, and this is the one that has the most literature on the books. Back in the 60s, the veterinarians employed by Canada and the United States and other countries were very concerned about food security and about what sort of food security would look like after a nuclear strike. Now, one of the papers I read claimed that a 5 megaton bomb would leave a fallout cloud 40 miles wide and 200 miles downwind. I'm not a nuclear scientist. You can tell me if that's accurate or not. But what that means is there's basically a giant area which is now contaminated with radiation. That includes the soil, the water, the buildings, and as well as the animals and the people living in that area. The people who are not immediately killed by the strike from a nuclear weapon would be therefore contaminated by radioactive isotopes. Contamination is different than exposure. Of course, exposure means that the animal has animal or human has been exposed to those radioisotopes, contamination means that it's attached to their skin or in their bodies. With food animals in particular, this becomes a big problem. After a nuclear strike, one of the first things that will happen is there will be no more refrigeration in most parts of the world that are affected by this, and there will be no more transportation. So very quickly, meat will spoil. There will be less food, and there will be a massive food security issue. So preserving the livestock that survive this sort of strike will be of paramount importance. The other importance will be trying to prevent and contain the spread of the radioactive isotopic fallout and the effects thereof. What that means is that you have to establish a quarantine zone around the fallout areas. This would basically involve establishing a massive containment zone in areas that are affected by fallout. Now, depending on the severity of a nuclear exchange, this may be just one part of a country, this may be multiple parts of a country, or entire countries could be designated as fallout zones depending on how big the fallout cloud becomes. And this is something that could develop over weeks to months because, of course, fallout blows with the wind and moves with air currents, that kind of thing. I'm not a nuclear scientist, so if I'm getting anything wrong here, of course, correct me in the comments, but this is from what I've read in my knowledge of this subject. So what this would imply is that you basically have to set up, just like with an outbreak of a zoonotic disease or epidemic epizootic disease, you need to establish a quarantine area. You need to establish appropriate slaughterhouse facilities within those areas so that animals that are designated for slaughter can be fed. Now, animals will be contaminated in this fallout area by radiation. However, we may not have the luxury of deciding to cull the animals that are affected by that if it's widespread enough. We need to feed people first and foremost and worry about the effects later. What this would imply is that you can't have, as long as you have separate facilities of contaminated versus uncontaminated meat, you could theoretically use the contaminated meat to feed contaminated people living in the fallout zone, because of course feeding them is the primary importance. Now there will be differing levels of fallout depending on what production system we're looking at here. From the literature that I've read, small ruminants like goats and sheep will have more concentrated radioactive isotopes. They have a longer biological half-life than other livestock animals like cattle. This is because they tend to excrete those sort of things in their urine and feces slower. They also tend to graze closer to the ground, which means that they are going to accumulate the more of those isotopes that are in the soil. So it may be that those are the most suspicious in terms of meat and milk. The least suspicious would be pigs and chickens that are living in indoor housing facilities. Because they're not exposed to the soil, they're theoretically less exposed to the fallout, although it may be in the air and it may be in water sources that are contaminated. Cattle are kind of a middle ground there in that they are not grazing as close to the ground, but they're still outside for the most part. And cattle milk will be, tends to be, dairy cows that milk tends to be less contaminated than the meat. Other things to consider here too is that there are chelating agents, so there are things that you can give to animals to actually remove radioactive isotopes, such as cesium, and one of those would be like Russian blue. So you could use that for individual animals if needed. Other things to consider too in kind of the months to years afterwards is that the effects of deleterious negative mutations will accumulate. So you have to think about radiation, just like when you get a sunburn, it predisposes you to cancer, and the more radiation exposure you have, the greater the risk of developing cancer. The same thing happens in the germline as well. So in the sperm and the eggs of the animal, the more radiation exposure that they're exposed to, the higher the likelihood of a mutation in that germline. Most of these mutations in the calves, the lambs, the chicks that are born after this nuclear event will be negative mutations. They will be ones that decrease the lifespan, decrease productivity, and decrease fertility. Those are all very negative things in a population that is food insecure. They don't have enough food to feed themselves, or they're undergoing malnutrition. So what this means is that you would have to get uncontaminated sperm from animals that are outside of the fallout zones, and also be breeding chickens in poultry areas outside of the areas and moving them into contaminated areas. This would be, of course, involve a large amount of theriogenology and production animal medicine to make that work. So between the quarantining, the establishing and inspecting slaughterhouse facilities within fallout areas and this breeding, there's a lot of work for food animal veterinarians. But what about companion animal veterinarians? I haven't talked a lot about companion animals so far. Are they superfluous? Are they something that we can just kind of ignore in these situations? Well, the short answer is no. You see, people don't necessarily abandon their animals during times of disasters. In fact, they may double down on them. We noticed that after, of course, Katrina and the Australian bushfires, people were very reluctant to evacuate without their animals. In fact, they will resist evacuation orders if they are told to separate from their animals. People have very deep bonds with their pets and companion animals, and they're very reluctant to break that. Animals can provide a lot of stress relief. They can help with depression and anxiety, and provide a sense of security during these times, basically. So that access to companion animals is really important for mental health that way. And it can be one of the few things that people cling on to after such a horrific event. The other things to keep in mind is that companion animals will still need medicine, and they will still be, important for public health reasons. After the Fukushima incident, for instance, we found that there was a higher incidence of dog bites. You see, people left their dogs behind. Those neglected dogs became hungrier and more desperate, but they were habituated to people, so they were more likely to bite people. Fortunately, in Japan, they don't have a lot of terrestrial rabies, and they don't have canine rabies. In places that have endemic canine rabies, where dogs have naturally occurring rabies, as well as places where there are terrestrial animals like skunks, foxes, raccoons, that kind of thing, dogs would be more likely to transmit rabies to human beings. And this poses a huge public health risk in the event of a nuclear strike. And you don't think about the rabies aspect of this, but there is actually a huge rabies aspect. So veterinarians would be involved in vaccinating animals for rabies and identifying signs of rabies and, and trying to contain the spread of that basically as well. Of course, animals will still need veterinary care afterwards. We know that after the COVID-19 pandemic, for instance, people adopted animals in massive numbers because they needed the security. They wanted the psychological benefits of owning a pet. And during those trying times, they turned to animals and they turned to the veterinary profession. And we had unprecedented numbers. Similar things could happen after a nuclear strike as well. If you lose family members, or if you have a disruption to your social life, if you have disruption to life in general, you're going to want security and you're going to want the benefits of that. So people will turn to adopting new pets, which means new puppies, new kittens. It means more veterinary medicine in the long run. It also means that animals that are exposed to ionizing radiation are more likely to develop cancers. And I mentioned this before, but I want to get a little bit more into what that means. We know after Chernobyl that dogs living in the exclusion zone are more likely to develop the bone, liver, muscle, skin, and thyroid cancers and bone marrow cancers. Dogs are more susceptible to, sensitive, I should say, to radiation poisoning and to that sort of thing. We believe that they have a longer biological half-life than human beings, which means they're not able to clear radioisotopes as easily, which means, it takes them longer for them to urinate and excrete those isotopes out. This means they have a higher risk of developing those cancers, which means shorter lifespans, and it means that they need treatment, at least pain control, if nothing else, but also, chemotherapy in some of these cases. You're looking at least, palliative care, if nothing else. And that is another role that veterinarians will be playing in this kind of post-nuclear landscape. Now, the role of an individual veterinarian is really going to vary depending on their expertise, where they're at, the circumstances on the ground, as well as how they are in their own lives. And, there's going to be a lot of individual factors. I, for instance, probably won't make it to this post-nuclear landscape that I'm describing. I live in a big city. I live near government and military installations. It's very likely that I would die within the first seconds to hours to days afterwards due to either, immediate, destruction by the nuclear weapon, if not by radiation sickness and radiation burns. So it is something that I do think about, because it is something that is becoming more common in our, even in the, in this so-called post-Cold War landscape. We have multiple powers with nuclear weapons that are ready and willing to use them. This includes the United States, this includes Russia, this includes many other countries in the world. And that is something that I think we as veterinarians need to make very loud and clear, that the use of nuclear weapons should never be acceptable, and that we are opposed to the use and testing of them, because it does pose a international health and safety risk to everyone, including the animals who have no part in this sort of nuclear war, but they will pay the price. I'm not going to touch so much on the environmental aspects about like endangered species, about radiation accumulation in the environment. That's a little beyond my area of knowledge, and it's something that would of course be less urgent in the post-nuclear era. I hope that covers the subject, at least introduces you to some of these ideas. I want you to think about kind of what your life might look like in these sort of situations, because it may help you come to realize how precarious life can be in our 21st century lifestyle. And it's something that I think is, downplayed today. We don't talk about it as much anymore because there's no longer a Cold War, but there's still many nuclear reactors in the world, and they may not have your best interest in mind. So thank you so much for watching. It's a little bit of another dark episode. Hopefully, maybe next time I'll do a silly one in the next couple of weeks or so. But leave a comment down below if I missed something, if this was inaccurate, if you don't like what I'm talking about, or if you have any beefs. Of course, put them in the comment section below, and I will see you next time. Peace.